Well, good evening to you all, and let me wish you all a happy World Book Day. My name is Jonathan Straight. If you don't know me, I'm one of the directors of MILIM, a partner organisation of Leeds Lit Fest. And I'd like to welcome you all to the 5th Leeds Lit Fest, which is brought to you by 8 Leeds-based creative arts and literature-based organisations which are committed to celebrating and championing literature and writing in Leeds and inspiring people to get involved in creative activities linked to literature. Leeds Lit Fest is supported by Leeds 2023. This is our city's year of cultural transformation. And I'd like to extend our thanks to the Leeds Library for hosting this evening. There's no fire drill planned, so if the fire alarm does go off, please leave by the way you came in. There's also a fire escape somewhere over there. And so to our guest, Abi Silver was born in Leeds, where she attended Roundhay School, inspired by watching Granada Television's Crown Court between lessons. She went on to study law at Girton College, Cambridge. Abi worked as a lawyer in London before spending 5 years in Israel, where she completed an MBA by distance learning and began to write fiction. Her first courtroom drama, featuring the legal duo Judith Burton and Constance Lamb, was published in 2017 and was shortlisted for the Waverton Good Read Award. Since then, she has published 5 more books in the series. The Ambrosia Project, this one, which seems to be quite hard to get hold of at the moment, is the most recent and will form the basis of our conversation today. Abi now lives in Hertfordshire, and so it's a pleasure to welcome her back to her hometown. Welcome, Abi.
Thank you. Thank you. I'm delighted to be here.
Now, when did you first realise that you wanted to be a writer?
So I certainly never thought about writing as a career. What I actually remember is that at school, when we were about 15, we had to do one of these careers questionnaires, kind of really newfangled. And I don't know what answer I put, but it said that I was destined to be a prison warden. So I think writing was always a part of my life because my father was an English teacher, my mother was a teacher, our house was always full of books, which obviously gave me a tremendous advantage. And I always loved writing, whether it was short stories or poems, or I used to take the popular songs of the time and change all the lyrics. I used to write protest essays about things that bothered me in the world. So I think, looking back on it, it was my way of making sense of what was in my head. You know, everything might be a bit jumbled up, but if I put it down on a piece of paper in an orderly fashion, it kind of made sense. But as you said, obviously I was very busy. I became a lawyer, I had a family, and I didn't have much time to think about it until I was on maternity leave now 23 years ago. And as a family, we went to live in Israel because we went with my husband's work. And late at night, when the house was finally quiet, I had a little bit of me time. And that was when I started to write and actually wrote a complete novel. That novel has never been published. It probably never will be published. I think, like many authors, the first time you try to write something, you realise perhaps it's not quite as good as you first thought it was. So that's in a bottom drawer. But that was really when I thought about the possibility of writing. We fast forward then, because we came back to the UK. I actually returned to full-time work as a lawyer, and a good few more years passed. And then for various reasons, I took a career break. And I suddenly thought, you know what, I'd really love to pick up the writing again. And write something commercial, something people will want to buy. And I thought about crime, and obviously with my legal background, I thought about writing a legal thriller. And that was when I wrote the book, which then became the Pinocchio Brief.
So you're a lawyer. Do you still practice as a lawyer? And do you think being a lawyer helps with your writing?
So I gave up working permanently in a full-time job at the end of 2014. Can't believe it's that long ago. And since then I've worked as a consultant. So I have periods where I work for 7, 8, 9 months full-time as a lawyer. And then I take 7 or 8 months off and write full time. And for me, that's a very, very good balance. Being a lawyer certainly helps. I mean, it helps with the subject matter of these books because I hope it gives them authenticity because my main characters are lawyers. We have, we have a lot of courtroom drama, which I hope is realistic because of my background. I think also it keeps my ideas current. But also as lawyers, you're very used to a sedentary lifestyle and sitting in front of a laptop for hours on end. So I had that discipline as well, which you need when you're writing, because it does take a long time to write a book. And you have to be prepared to go back over it again and again and edit it.
How long does it, I mean, typically, how long does it take you to write one of these?
It takes me about 6 months full time writing to produce the first draft, really, because I do a lot of research for my books, and that tends to take up a month or two, really. And then I have to decide how much of the research to put in the book. So there'll be an awful lot. I suppose it's a bit like an iceberg. There's an awful lot that you don't really see because you don't want a fiction book to be like a textbook. You want to kind of drop little bits into it. So you do loads of research and only a little bit ends up in the finished product. So about 6 months. And then I'm very lucky. My publisher, Iron Lightning Books, they're a small independent publisher, which means they're very nimble. So it usually takes about another 6 months to bring the book up to the stage that it can be sold, with the editing process and the cover and those kind of things.
Now you've got these two main characters that appear throughout the series, the lawyer and the barrister. How did you create these characters, and are they actually based on anybody real?
So, I mean, obviously I have to be very careful because I still work as a lawyer and obviously all the work I do is confidential. And so what I usually say is that Constance and Judith are very much, I suppose, an amalgamation of people I've worked with over the years. I've obviously worked with wonderful, talented, clever lawyers, men and women, and I like to draw from that in their characters.
What about a duo, though? Is there something particularly attractive about writing about a duo?
I think so. I mean, you've got Sherlock Holmes, but you've also got Dr. Watson, haven't you? And also I grew up on early 80s TV, so, Starsky and Hutch, Cagney and Lacey, Bodie and Doyle, that was always what I loved. And it's a very easy, natural way of bringing different viewpoints across in the story. So Constance and Judith are very different. So Constance is the solicitor. She's young, or certainly in the first book, the Pinocchio Brief, where they first meet, she's young. She's brought up in the East End of London. She's Black. She has a very kind of determined attitude to everything she does. Judith is much older. She's in her 40s when we first meet her. She's had much more of a privileged background. She's white. She's not scared to say exactly what she thinks, which sometimes upsets other people. So when I explore different themes in my books, I kind of have these two different perspectives, because Judith, perhaps a little bit like me, is always a bit suspicious of new ways of doing things and prefers the traditional. But Constance is much more accepting, as younger people are, of new things. And so it's very easy for me to, through their voices, show different sides of whatever it is I'm writing about.
And they appear in a series of books. So from an author's perspective, is there an advantage to writing a series? And was that your intention at the beginning?
So, well, no, it's quite funny. I remember very clearly that the Pinocchio Brief had come out, and I was here talking about it. I went to Crime Fest in Bristol, which is a wonderful festival in May each year, and I went there as a debut author. And everybody was talking about their second book, and I was kind of sitting there thinking, I'm supposed to have written another. mean, it's a bit like that with my children, actually. I think, you know, as I've got some of my son's friends here, I've got to be a little bit careful. But you know, I had my first son, and it was like, well, I've got to do another one. So I hadn't thought about it, but then obviously, with the success of the first book, I thought, let's write another. And I always have plenty of ideas. I think why readers like the series is because it gives them more time with the characters, so they can get to know and love them. And you can also bring back characters that people like or dislike in a later story, which is a nice thing to be able to do. From a writing perspective, I think it's a bit like the difference between maybe going out for dinner with old friends and going out on a first date. You know, so you've got that familiarity with the characters, and you got a common history, so things sort of flow easily, but you perhaps haven't got the excitement you might have. And yes, it's quite a long time since I went on a first date, but if I could think back that far, you know, anything's possible when you write something new. So so I have enjoyed writing the series so far, and I've got lots of ideas for where it could go next.
Interesting. So tell me, and this is a question that always fascinates me with the many authors I speak to what extent do you plan the book? And I suppose it might be slightly different with crime novels because there's got to be a structure of sorts. But to what extent are the books planned before you start to write them? And what about the ending? You know, do you decide how the book's going to finish before you start it?
So I think from the people I've heard speaking, you know, the crime writers I've heard speaking, it does differ even amongst our community. I don't plan very much, which frustrates my editor enormously. I tend to have an idea of where it's going to begin and an idea of where it's going to end. And generally, the particular theme that I'm interested in covering, this time it's about food, but for example, in my first book, The Pinocchio Brief, it was about lie detecting software nicknamed Pinocchio, which you know, detects people telling a lie by the way they move their face or their body. So I certainly had an idea of what I was going to say about that topic, and the characters who I might introduce, but I kind of like to just get into the meat of the writing and let the characters take me somewhere. And that has meant on at least 2 occasions that when I've got to the end of the book, I've decided to change who done it. And I always like to think that then I must have crafted it quite carefully, because if as the writer, I don't know who done it, then certainly the readers won't know that either. And obviously it necessitates a little bit of going back and rewriting a bit, but that's how I have tried writing in a very structured way, which I know people often do with post-its all over the place, a detailed plan, and I find that's too restrictive. So I like to let the characters kind of
take the story. I mean, there are certainly twists towards the end of this book, but the way that the sort of legal process unfolds, I would have thought was very planned. And if you're writing that as you go along, that really is impressive and quite fascinating. Now let's talk about this book, the Ambrosia Project. I'm not going to give anything away, but it's about food, or maybe the future of food. Was there something particular that made you want to write about food as a subject?
Well, first of all, I like food, so it was kind of a topic close to my heart. I think there were a whole series. So whenever I write a story, there's usually 2 or 3 different ideas, concepts that come together for me at the same time. And then I want to. That's what makes me want to write the story. So it won't just be one idea. That won't be enough. I'll hold that, or I'll make a note of it. Then something else will happen, and 2 or 3 things, and then I'll finally think, gosh, I could make that into a story. So I think this time there were a few things. I read an article in New Scientist, which is a magazine that I absolutely love and get loads and loads of ideas from, all about trees and the way that trees are sentient and that they work in communities together, particularly, you know, if you're in woodland or forests, and that if one particular tree is ill or diseased, then the others can kind of send reinforcements to help it. And I was reading all of this and I was thinking, wow, if trees are sentient, what are vegans going to do? So I was kind of, that was my first thought. And then actually my husband was talking all about insects as a new food source. So I sort of scribbled that away as well. And then because of Brexit, I knew that we've had a lot of changes in the rules about how we label food, or at least how we're going to label food and the food that we can eat. And it may mean that things that we didn't want to eat before because perhaps we thought they weren't so good for us will now be allowed into the country and we'll be eating them, or we'll know less about where they came from. So and that's kind of with the lawyer's angle, I was thinking about that. So those all came together. And in the story, and I can probably say, I know you've been very careful not to say too much, but I think it's in the blurb. It's in the blurb on the back, so we can just say a little bit what happened. So at the beginning, we have a CEO of a food company who, you know, a big company that manufactures and distributes food, who's really, really interested in the future of food and what it's good for us all to be eating. And he stands up at an event which he's arranged with a whole series of other people from the food industry. So we have a farmer who is very interested in sustainable beef farming. We have a blogger who writes a blog called Meat and No Veg, which is all about, in her view, how we should all eat a completely carnivorous diet. No vegetables at all, they're all terrible for us. We have a scientist who is researching feeding larvae to livestock and what you can feed the soldier fly larvae on you know, to feed them up before you feed them to the livestock. We've got a vegan TV chef and we have a radio host who sort of advocates eating for pleasure, eating whatever you like as long as it makes you happy. So they're all at this event and poor old Brett Ingram stands up to speak and suddenly dies on the spot. And the caterer is accused of killing him because it seems he has a food allergy. And so Judith and Constance come in to defend the caterer, but they begin to suspect for various reasons that perhaps maybe one of the other people who was at the event had something to do with his death. And so through the story, and obviously we do find out in the end who done it this time, but because I've got all these different characters with their different interests, it allows me to say things about the world of food and perhaps to voice some of my concerns about where it's all going.
And you get into these people's roles in fairly intricate detail. Now, are you able to do that purely through desktop research, or do you actually find people and query them as to what they do in their day-to-day activities?
So with this book, and actually with the Midas game, which I read the year before, I had the problem that I was writing during COVID. So any kind of face-to-face meeting was out of the question. You can do a huge amount from home nowadays. So I do an awful lot of research from home. It does sometimes mean I don't necessarily just do internet research. I might buy a book that somebody's written and read that as well. I'm very lucky with all the kind of pathology input. So in every story, because if somebody dies, I always speak to a pathologist. I'm very lucky that I have a friend who's a pathologist. And it's really important to me that it's all plausible and that everything fits together. With this book, because it's a little bit more intricate, because obviously they think that the person's died as a result of food that is eaten. I spoke to another forensic pathologist and we tried to make sure that it was all very convincing. And And over the years, I've spoken to a whole array of professional people that the Cinderella plan is about someone who has an accident in a driverless car. So I was lucky enough to speak to a police officer who was a car crash expert, and we talked about, you know, the markings on the road and all those kinds of things. So people are very, very prepared to give their time and even to review drafts so that I can make sure I get things right. But most of the time I do it from home.
Interesting. So Judith, the barrister, she's very much presented as some kind of superhuman genius through the book, and she continues to impress the reader and Constance with the way she uncovers clues and sees things that no one else has seen. And yet towards the end of the book, you see a very different side to her. She's riddled with self-doubt. And I just wondered whether that was something you'd found with sort of high-level barristers, or whether it was something you'd woven into her character for some other reason.
Well, I think she's human. And she's also had 5 books where I think she has been a bit of a superhero. So we've come to book 6, and I'm showing a little bit more of her vulnerable side, I think. But with anyone who is a professional who has a very high pressure job, as she does, because if you imagine, you know, as a criminal barrister, people's lives depend on her, their liberty. There have to be moments, I think, especially if things don't always go exactly right, where you doubt yourself. So there is a little bit of that in the story to I think reflect what happens in real life. And everybody has that kind of professional side and the side they show to the world, don't they? And then they have what happens when they're at home, and perhaps it's not quite so visible to everyone else. So I have written some of that into this story, yes.
Now, are you an author who's influenced by other writing? And if so, whose writing do you enjoy?
I kind of read anything and everything now I have a bit more time. I certainly was very influenced as a girl by all the Sherlock Holmes stories, which I love. I still have this great big book. It's an illustrated Sherlock Holmes, and I used to read it under the covers at night, and I'm sure that had a very big influence. And all the Hardy Boy mysteries and Nancy Drew and that kind of thing. And I grew up on the classics, unsurprisingly, because that was what my father had in the house. But now I just read as widely as I can. There are wonderful crime fiction writers. But I also really like, names, I really like Kate Atkinson, who obviously is localish, and has written both her Jackson Brodie crime series, but also much more expansive novels. And I also like Joanne Harris, who is very local with a kind of much more magical realism. So, but really, I mean, why it's so competitive, the business, but it's so competitive because there are so many wonderful authors out there, really.
And there's a bit of this book that sort of touches on magic realism, isn't there? There's an element of something that's not quite real. I thought that was quite interesting.
There is a little bit, and it is, for the first time, actually. And also there's a nod in here to a Roald Dahl story as well, which I remember, which is all about, I won't spoil it, but it's a story that I remember from the Tales of the Unexpected Days, which is all about trees and trees feeling pain.
Which they may or may not
do. They may or may not do.
Why is it you think crime literature is so popular? It's hugely popular.
It is. I suppose, first of all, because there are so many good writers, definitely. I think it also covers, if you talk about crime, it's so wide-ranging. So you have historical crime, you have psychological thrillers, you have the kind of cozy crime where somebody's, you know, squashed by a pumpkin in an allotment. You have legal thrillers, you have action, spy, you know, John le Carré type stuff. So there's something for everyone, I think, within the crime genre. And also, as we were discussing a little bit just before I began my talk, I think what you have in crime novels is generally you have a beginning, middle and end, and the criminal, the villain, gets his or her just desserts. So within the pages of the book, there's resolution and there's justice. And I think that's quite nice because you don't always get that in real life, but within the pages of a book, when you start to read a crime novel, you can be fairly confident that you will get that within the story. And certainly for me, that's something I like. And when I read these books nowadays that maybe are a bit more episodic, you know, a little snapshot of somebody's life, I might like them, but I'm always thinking, well, there's no closure. I really want to know what happened next. I don't want to be left hanging.
But in a sense, you know, every crime book finishes with a resolution. I just wondered if you'd ever been tempted not to resolve the case in one of your books. I mean, presumably somebody's done that, but somewhere in the history of the genre.
Yeah, yes. I mean, I do it, I suppose, a little bit with the personal lives of the characters, because those are going to carry on. So there's lots of things left unsaid and undone for Constance and Judith. And the other thing, so usually with the stories, we have the trial and somebody is found guilty or not guilty. But I'm very conscious that often in a courtroom, you don't get the whole story. So, you know, it's quite interesting that you swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. But actually, often what you get in a courtroom is only what the lawyers want you to see in terms of the way they present the case, either because if they're for the prosecution, they're looking at what evidence is going to get the conviction. And if you're acting for the defendant, you may, so for example, often the defendant won't give evidence themselves. And usually that's because the lawyer is a bit worried that they won't perform particularly well and they might give something away. So in real life, actually, in a courtroom, you don't often get the whole story, you get parts of the story. And so what I do at the end of my books sometimes is I have a kind of a little codicil, you know, I have Constance and Judith sitting in the pub having a little chat about the case and perhaps filling in a few of the gaps that you might not have been able to see, or because you might be in the heads of some of the characters during the story, you'll get to know as the reader some of the things that somebody wouldn't see as part of the jury or as part of the public in a trial. So I do try to give more away. I think I don't want to say too much about the first book, the Pinocchio Brief, but there is, because I don't want to give it away, but there is kind of a bit at the end there where I want people to question whether the person who ends up in jail is really the person who's responsible. So I quite like the idea of the fact that you have, you know, a whole chain of events which leads up to something bad happening. And it's that poem, you know, from one to the nail. So if any one of those little events hadn't happened, then perhaps the disaster would have been averted. So with our system, of course, we punish the person who's directly responsible, who, for want of a better word, you know, kind of stuck the knife in. But there might have been all kinds of reasons why they did what they did that perhaps are not their fault. So I like that idea as well.
I mean, I suppose as the author, you can somewhat play God, and you're telling the reader, you're giving the reader more or less information than is coming out in the trial, which I suppose builds the tension into the story. Who is the narrator in your books? I mean, I noticed the tone of the narrator's voice seemed to shift from character to character in this book. I couldn't speak about your other ones, I haven't read them yet. But who is the narrator, or who are the narrators?
So I think in the line with kind of more modern stories where people, the narrator, there's more than one narrator. So if you think in particular, the really well-known book is Gone Girl, which was made into a film, where obviously you have the husband and the wife's perspective on what's happened. And so the fashion is much more now to write in different points of view. And for the reader, what's so good about that is, of course, you really, well, so you know, you've got the what Atticus Finch, the lawyer in To Kill a Mockingbird, says to his daughter about how you don't really know a person till you get inside their skin and walk in their shoes, that kind of thing. So if you write from the perspective of different characters, then your readers are actually getting inside the heads of those characters and become much closer to them. So what I have done in this book is I have written from the perspective of a number of different characters. Obviously, the downside of that is as a reader, you've got to concentrate a bit harder because you're viewing the story from different perspectives. But what I hope it does is it brings you closer to each of those people and you get a feel for their personality.
How difficult is that to do? I mean, do you sort of have a crib sheet about what language and what foibles each character might exhibit?
I do have to remember, and what I often do when I get to the end of the story is I'll go back and just deal with the chapters that are for this particular character to try and make sure that the way they're speaking and behaving is consistent, and then I'll do it for the next character. And the other thing, you've also got to be really careful, because if one of the characters who is narrating the story is actually your villain, which they could be, you've got to be very careful that you don't give too much away. So you have to kind of steer away from having them talking or thinking about the events that, the crime, whatever it is. So it's not so easy, but it's fun. As a writer, it's fun to write in different voices, especially if they are. I mean, I think there's been a lot of discussion over the last few years about people writing characters who are not like themselves, especially from a different kind of social background, different race. I mean, to me, if you're a writer, you have to use your imagination and you have to try and inhabit all these other characters. If you don't do it well, fine, people can tell you haven't done a good job, but they should never tell you that you mustn't write a particular character. So I do my best to write all these varied, interesting, quirky characters, and I hope I succeed. But to me, that makes the book more enjoyable.
Now, you're from a Jewish background, and there's certainly no hint of Jewishness in this book. In fact, there was a reference to roast pork, which may or may not be from lived experience. I don't really want to know. But is this something you've explored in the past or might explore in the future?
So you're right. There are no overtly Jewish characters in the book. Absolutely not. I think that doesn't mean that the stories and the characters are not influenced by my outlook. And my outlook in turn is very much influenced by the person I am and the way I was brought up and all the things that appeal to me. So, being female, being a mother and a sister and a daughter, and being a northerner, and being educated in the state system, and being brought up in a very close-knit, warm, traditional Jewish community. I mean, those are all things that are part of me. And those are, I suppose, reflected in the values that I have, which in turn comes out through the stories. But whether I'm going to write something that's closer to home, I think we just watch this space.
So would you say there is a more serious message to these books beyond them being entertaining and fun to read?
I mean, maybe not so much message, but I think I've been, through my training as a lawyer, and I suppose maybe generally through life, I've always been taught to question and not to just accept things at face value. As lawyers, you're given facts and you're told to interrogate them and to try and get to the bottom of things. And so with all the topics that I cover in the stories, the lie detecting software, the prospect of robot doctors, are we going to have our criminal trials filmed? And is the public going to, laugh at the characters who stand up in court and pick them apart? Are we going to be living our lives through the internet and spending hours and hours gaming online? All these things that I write into my stories. What kind of food are we going to be eating? I just want people to think and question and not necessarily accept that new is better than old. When I always think back to the time when my grandmother came to live with us for a short period of time in the 1980s, and my dad had this stereo deck that, you know, was kind of a record player, CD player, cassette deck, radio, and at the bottom space for your records. And we thought this was the height of modern technology. We thought nothing is ever going to beat this. And my poor grandma, however many instructions we left her, she couldn't operate it. You know, she couldn't work out how to switch from the radio to the cassette or the CD. And we just thought, how hopeless is that? And of course, I'm now faced with all this digital technology that I can't work, and I have to ask for help all the time. So and some of it's fantastic, and some of it, you know, has enabled us to make leaps and bounds in medicine and in all kinds of areas. But it isn't all good, and I don't want us to just accept everything new as good without thinking about it. So I think that's probably the message that comes through my stories. If you want a message, but you can just read them as whodunnits if you like.
Do any of you have a question for Abi? Yeah.
Touching it a little bit, but I was wondering, what is your writing process when you come to write a conversation with, like, for example, Judith and Constance, because obviously they essentially come from you. So how do you kind of construct a conversation with you've had
Different people. Yeah, well, it's hard, and I actually end up, so I kind of have a go at writing it, and then I often end up walking around the house, sort of talking to myself and talking in two different voices and trying to think, well, would Judith say that? Would Constance say that? But it does become easier because now I've written a few books and I am more familiar with the characters, and I think of them as real people. And I think of whether is this the kind of thing that Judith would say and Constance would say. But again, as I was saying right at the beginning, the reason I don't like planning so much is I often just find I need to write it. And then when I see it on the page or I read it back, then I see if it works or not. It's quite hard for me to do it in the abstract.
Do you ever get writer's block? And if you do, how do you deal with it?
I do. I kind of, how to deal with it, I kind of cross my fingers and hope for the best. And I often, so usually it's that I'll be near the end and I'll think I want one final twist, or how am I going to make this, you know, really intriguing? What can I put in that's going to just add a little extra something? And I do my best thinking really in the early hours of the morning. So I'll just sort of go to sleep for a few nights and hope I'm going to wake up and there'll be some kind of inspiration. And usually it kind of just comes eventually. And I'll think, yes, and then if I don't write it down, I forget. So I have to write it down, otherwise by the morning it's gone.
Going right back to the beginning, jump very quickly from how you got into writing to your first thought. So how easy or difficult did you actually find getting into? You hear all sorts of stories, and you know, how did you find it getting that first breakthrough?
So in some ways it took years, because I'd written my first book 23 years ago, and actually I did have an agent then who liked my book, but he couldn't sell it, so he couldn't find anyone. They kind of said what they often say to not upset you, which is, we like it but we don't love it, which you have to get used to as a writer. So I was a bit disappointed, but as I say, I kind of moved on with my life and I thought that wasn't going to be for me. But when I then wrote the Pinocchio Brief, sort of, well, I suppose about 10 years later or more, I was very lucky. So I tried again to go through the traditional process, which is to find an agent and go to one of the big publishing houses. And that was very difficult. And I didn't manage, certainly in the time I was looking, to get myself an agent. And then a friend of mine was working with this publisher, Iron Lightning, who are one of a number of small publishers who are prepared to take manuscripts directly from authors, because otherwise most of the big houses you can only submit through an agent. And I understand why, but then obviously the bottleneck is at the agent stage, because everybody's desperate to find an agent. And the other thing that's quite difficult is that if your book doesn't sit in a particular genre very clearly, it's hard for the agents to sell it. So if it's a particularly quirky book, they don't know where it fits and they don't know how to market it. So I was then very lucky in that I submitted the manuscript to Iron Lightning and they said they liked it, and then they were working with an editor and I then worked with him. And so in a sense, that was very quick, but it was kind of about 13, 14, 15 years before I actually got there. But nowadays, a lot of people are self-publishing, and it used to be a little bit frowned upon. And now I think people realise that there are wonderful books that people self-publish, particularly because a lot of authors who perhaps are already published have then chosen the self-publishing route. And so they've already, it gives you, I mean, it can be more lucrative because you cut out the middleman. But it also gives you a lot of control over when your book comes out, how you want to market it. So some people who already have a following are choosing that now as a way forward. And I think it just improves variety for readers, really.
How much does the manuscript change through the editing process?
So it really depends. The editor I had at the beginning didn't used to change my book so much. He was very much concerned really in the plausibility of the storyline and generally kind of looking at the plot. And the editor I have now, who is herself a writer and you know, an extremely good writer and does an awful lot of editing. She's worked with me a lot more on, if you like, the more technical side of the writing, because I'm not trained. I didn't do an English course. I haven't done creative writing courses as some people do now. So I just kind of write from the heart. And so she's educated me a lot more about the structure of a story and how different ways that you might choose to write.
And how does that feel? Do you feel you are ending up with a better product, or do you feel it's something of an affront that somebody's interfering with your creative output?
So I think you have to, there's always a moment when you get the manuscript back, and it's a bit like having, you know, having your homework marked or having an exam paper marked, and it's kind of got red lines all over it. And of course, you kind of think, oh, well, I've written all these books. But if you want to improve, and I do want to improve, then you have to take all these comments on board. And obviously, when you write a book, you're so into it, you're so close to it that you can't often see the faults. And so obviously having somebody, and even having a friend read a book is really, really valuable because you get an objective view. So no, there'll always be a moment when I'll kind of think, oh, but then yes, I take the comments on board and I think the books are better as a result.
Is there a book you wish you'd written?
So the story, I mean, gosh, lots and lots of books I wish I'd written, including the ones that sell lots of copies. The story that I was thinking the other day that I absolutely love, which became a very successful film. It's the story of Slumdog Millionaire. So it has actually come from a book. There's a book called Q&A, which in itself was very successful. But I was just that idea that a person can answer all these varied questions in a quiz show on all kinds of different topics because of his life experiences. I just thought it was wonderful. I absolutely loved that as a concept. So I would have liked to write that story.
Any more from our audience? What about television? Can you see these two being part of a television series? Have you had any interest?
I definitely can, and it would be wonderful. I have had some interest, but like many authors, it hasn't yet gone very far. So it's such a long and difficult process. So lots of us sort of have interest, and then it doesn't go much further, or it gets to the stage where perhaps they're going to write a script, and obviously it's all about there being enough funding for the project and enough interest at the right time. So no, it would be wonderful. I would love it, but it hasn't yet.
You told us that you work for a number of months as a lawyer, and then you take time off to write the book. So if it's not a rude question, which career is more lucrative?
I think you probably know the answer to that. But most writers are not in it for the money. You know, we do it because we love it, and yeah, I think that probably answers your question.
So what's next for Abi Silver?
So I am writing. I'm actually writing two different things at the moment, and neither of them is a Burton and Lamb. There will be a Burton and Lamb in the future, but a new standalone crime novel and something else, which is quite different. So, but they'll take a little while to I think come to fruition.
Well, we'll look forward to those. Do come back and tell
Thank
us all
you.
about them when you've written them.
Thank you
So
so
no
much.
more questions. Thank you. Thank you very much. We have a little something to say thank you, which is some of my photographs of the Israeli ambulance service. You'll probably recognise, and either recognise some of the
Some of the
people or the
people.
places. And that was self-published. So
So I said the right things about it.
can be done. Now, that concludes our work for Leeds Lit Fest, but we do have a weekly webinar on a Monday night, so visit millim.org.uk for details about that. Our next event is a week on Monday, when Daniel Gold is speaking about his biography of the banker Edmund Safra, A Banker's Journey. It remains for me to thank our guest Abi Silver once again. Thank you so much, Abi, and that concludes this evening's presentation. Thank you so much.